A man built a monopoly so powerful that the government destroyed it, and he became 3 times richer the day they broke it apart. That's not failure, that's architecture. In 1911, the Supreme Court shattered Standard Oil into 34 pieces. Rockefeller owned shares in all 34. His net worth tripled within 2 years. The system wasn't defeated. It was designed to profit from its own destruction. And that same system, the one that turns even punishment into profit, is extracting wealth from your life right now. Let me show you how it works. In 1870, a 31-year-old bookkeeper in Cleveland, Ohio, controlled exactly 4% of America's oil refining capacity. 10 years later, that same man controlled 90%, not 40, not 60, 90% of an entire industry in a single decade. His name was John D. Rockefeller, and the system he built didn't die when the government broke it apart. It evolved, it spread, and right now in 2025, it controls the gasoline. You pump the medications, you swallow the platforms, you scroll, and the banks that hold every dollar you've ever saved. But here's what makes this story different from every rich guy built an empire narrative you've heard before. When the Supreme Court shattered Standard Oil into 34 separate companies, in 1911 Rockefeller's net worth didn't collapse. It tripled. The man who was supposed to be punished walked away 3 times richer than before. That's not an accident. That's architecture. Frank Tarbell still remembered the exact moment his life changed. It was 1872, and he was standing in his small refinery office in Titusville, Pennsylvania, watching the numbers on his ledger turn from black to red. He'd spent 8 years building that refinery. 8 years of 16-hour days, of mortgaging his family home, of promising his wife that the sacrifice would pay off. That morning, Standard Oil dropped kerosene prices below what it cost Frank to produce. Not below his profit margin. Below his production cost. Every barrel he refined, he lost money. Every day he stayed open, he moved closer to bankruptcy. 3 months later, Frank Tarbell sold his refinery to Rockefeller for 40 cents on the dollar. His daughter Ida was 15 years old. She watched her father come home that night, sit down at the kitchen table, and weep. 28 years later, Ida Tarbell would publish the most devastating corporate expose in American history. But we'll get to that. What most people get wrong about Rockefeller is that they think he was just greedy. They imagine a cartoon villain in a top hat, rubbing his hands together, cackling about money. That's comfortable. That's easy to dismiss. The truth is far more disturbing. Rockefeller genuinely believed he was doing God's work. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a con man who traveled the countryside selling fake cancer cures for $25 a bottle. He had a second family that John didn't know about until adulthood. He disappeared for months at a time, leaving John's mother to raise 5 children alone. His mother, Eliza, was a devout Baptist who taught John that every penny must be accounted for, that waste was sin, and that discipline was the path to salvation. The con man's ruthlessness, the Baptist's moral certainty. These two forces fused in John D. Rockefeller to create something the world had never seen before, a monopolist who believed monopoly was righteous. Competition is a sin. That's a direct quote. Most people hear it as greed. Rockefeller meant it as theology. Competition wastes resources. Competition duplicates effort. Competition destroys capital through inefficiency. Consolidation in Rockefeller's mind was moral because it eliminated waste and served consumers through lower prices. He wasn't stealing. He was organizing chaos into divine order. And here's the part that should keep you awake at night, he was partially right. Before Standard Oil dominated the market, kerosene cost 58 cents per gallon. After Rockefeller's efficiencies took hold, it cost 8 cents, an 86% price reduction. The average American family could suddenly afford to light their homes after dark. That's not exploitation. That's genuine value creation. But Alexander Morrison would have disagreed. Morrison was 43 years old in 1879, owner of a mid-sized refinery in Pittsburgh. He'd survived the Cleveland Massacre of 1872, when Rockefeller absorbed 25 of Cleveland's 26 refineries in 3 months. Morrison thought Pittsburgh was safe. He was wrong. On a Tuesday morning in March, a Standard Oil representative named Henry Rogers arrived at Morrison's office. Picture it, a man in an expensive suit, soft-spoken, almost gentle, laying out the terms with the calm of someone discussing the weather. Sell your refinery to Standard Oil at fair market value. Keep your dignity. Maybe even stay on as a manager. Or refuse and watch what happens next. Morrison refused. Within 6 weeks, the railroad that shipped Morrison's oil raised his freight rates by 40%. The same railroad gave Standard Oil a secret rebate that made their shipping essentially free. Morrison's kerosene, which had sold for 12 cents, now cost him 14 cents to deliver. Standard Oil's kerosene sold for 9 cents. If you could see the documents from this period, you'd find railroad contracts with hidden clauses, rebate agreements that were technically illegal even then, and a paper trail that reads like a manual for economic assassination. Morrison held on for 11 months. He burned through his savings, mortgaged his home, borrowed from his brother. In February 1880, he sold his refinery to Standard Oil for 32 cents on the dollar. He never entered the oil business again. Here's a question that should bother you. Why do we remember Rockefeller as a businessman, but not as the architect of a system Carnegie built steel mills? When he died, U.S. Steel continued, but his personal control ended. Vanderbilt built railroads. When he died, the empire fragmented. Morgan built financial institutions. When he died, his dominance faded. But Rockefeller built something different. He built a method. Vertical integration, horizontal consolidation, regulatory capture, tax-exempt foundations, the trust structure that became the modern holding company. These aren't just strategies. They're the DNA of corporate America. By 1882, Rockefeller's lawyers had invented something that changed history forever, the Standard Oil Trust. The legal innovation seems technical, almost boring. But what it enabled was anything but. Standard Oil of Ohio couldn't legally own companies in other states. But a trust could hold the stock of companies anywhere. 41 shareholders, all Rockefeller and his closest associates, controlled the trust. The trust controlled 41 companies. One man through one legal structure controlled an entire industry across an entire nation. This was the template. Every monopoly that followed every holding company that exists today, every corporate structure from Berkshire Hathaway to Alphabet to Meta, they're all descendants of what Rockefeller's lawyers created in 1882. And the most disturbing part, the system was designed to survive its own destruction. We'll get to the breakup. We'll get to why shattering Standard Oil into 34 pieces made Rockefeller 3 times richer. We'll get to how those 34 companies spent the next century quietly merging back together until today, when most of them have reconsolidated into ExxonMobil, Chevron, and BP. But first, you need to understand what Rockefeller understood before anyone else: the most powerful monopoly isn't a company. It's a method. And that method is still extracting wealth from you right now today, with every tank of gas, every Amazon package, every Google search, every prescription you fill. The question isn't whether you're inside Rockefeller's system. The question is whether you can see the walls. The most powerful monopoly isn't a company. It's a method. And that method is still extracting wealth from you right now with every tank of gas, every Amazon package, every prescription you fill. To understand how Rockefeller built that method, you need to understand what America looked like before he arrived. In 1859, a man named Edwin Drake struck oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania. Within months, thousands of prospectors flooded into western Pennsylvania, drilling wherever they could find land. Fortunes were made and lost overnight. A farmer who discovered oil on his property could become a millionaire by Tuesday and bankrupt by Friday. Prices swung wildly from $20 a barrel to 10 cents sometimes in the same month. This was the oil rush, and it was pure chaos. Picture the Pennsylvania oil fields in 1861, Wooden derricks scattered across muddy hillsides, men covered in black crude wrestling with primitive equipment barrels stacked haphazardly waiting for transport that might never come. There was no infrastructure, no standards, no predictability. A refiner in Cleveland couldn't know what he'd pay for crude oil next week, let alone next year. Most people saw opportunity in drilling. Rockefeller saw something else entirely. He saw that drillers were gamblers. They depended on luck where the oil was, how much flowed when it would run dry. But refiners turned crude oil into kerosene, the fuel that lit American homes. That wasn't gambling. That was manufacturing. And manufacturing could be controlled. In 1863, at age 23, Rockefeller invested $4,000 in a Cleveland refinery. Within 2 years, it was the largest refinery in the city. But Cleveland had 30 refineries, all competing fiercely, all operating on thin margins, all one bad month away from bankruptcy. Here's where Rockefeller's mind worked differently than everyone else's. Most businessmen thought about beating competitors. Rockefeller thought about eliminating competition itself. Samuel Andrews was Rockefeller's first partner, a British immigrant who understood the chemistry of refining better than anyone in Cleveland. Andrews remembered sitting in Rockefeller's office in 1867, watching his partner sketch out a diagram on a piece of paper. Most refineries, Rockefeller explained, bought barrels from barrel makers, paid railroads to ship oil, sold kerosene to distributors. 3 separate businesses, taking profit at every step. What if Rockefeller asked, we owned all 3 steps ourselves? Andrews didn't understand at first. Why would an oil refiner want to make barrels? That's a different business entirely. But Rockefeller saw what Andrews couldn't. Every middleman was a leak in the profit pipeline. Every supplier had leverage over you. Every distributor could switch to a competitor. Control the entire chain, and you control the economics of the entire industry. This is vertical integration. It sounds like business jargon. It's actually the foundation of modern corporate power. Think of it like a restaurant that grows its own vegetables, raises its own cattle mills, its own flour, and owns the trucks that deliver to customers. Every step that used to generate profit for someone else now generates profit for you. Every cost that used to be fixed is now under your control. Every supplier who could have squeezed you now works for you. Within 3 years, Rockefeller owned barrel factories, tank cars, warehouses, and distribution networks. His cost to produce kerosene dropped 30% below his competitors. Not because he was more efficient at refining, because he'd eliminated the middlemen that everyone else still paid. But vertical integration was only half the method. Remember Frank Tarbell, the refiner whose daughter watched him weep at the kitchen table? Frank competed with Rockefeller on refining. He thought that was the game. He never understood that Rockefeller had changed the rules of the game entirely. What most people get wrong about monopolies is that they think monopolists win by being better. Lower prices, higher quality, superior service. That's the story we tell ourselves because it's comfortable. The truth is different. Monopolists win by making competition impossible. In 1872, Rockefeller negotiated a secret deal with the major railroads serving Cleveland. The deal was simple. Standard Oil would guarantee high shipping volumes. In exchange, the railroads would charge Standard Oil lower rates than any competitor. But here's the part that sounds illegal. Because it was illegal, the railroads would also pay Standard Oil a rebate on every barrel shipped by competitors. Read that again. When Frank Tarbell shipped his kerosene on the Lakeshore Railroad, part of what he paid went directly into Rockefeller's pocket. Tarbell was literally funding his own destruction every time he shipped a barrel of oil. This is the mechanism. This is how the system actually worked. The railroads weren't neutral infrastructure. They were weapons, and Rockefeller controlled the weapons. James Corrigan was a refinery owner in Cleveland who figured out the rebate scheme. He was 41 years old, had built his business over 12 years, and employed 37 workers. In January 1872, Corrigan marched into the offices of the Lakeshore Railroad and demanded the same rates Standard Oil received. The railroad executives listened politely. They showed him the door. Corrigan had no leverage. Standard Oil shipped 15 times his volume. Why would the railroad risk losing Rockefeller to help Corrigan? 3 months later, Corrigan was one of 25 refinery owners who sold to Standard Oil during the Cleveland massacre. He got fair market value. He kept his dignity. He never knew that the fair market value of his refinery had been artificially crushed by a rebate scheme he never saw. Here's a question that reveals the architecture. Why would the railroads agree to this? Because Rockefeller offered them something more valuable than any single customer's business. He offered predictability, guaranteed volumes, stable revenue. In an industry defined by boom and bust, Rockefeller was the only operator who could promise the railroads consistent business year after year. The railroads weren't villains. They were rational actors responding to incentives. And Rockefeller had designed the incentives. This is the second mechanism, horizontal integration. If vertical integration means controlling the supply chain, horizontal integration means buying or destroying every competitor until you're the only one left. And Rockefeller executed it with surgical precision. Between January and March 1872, Standard Oil acquired 25 of Cleveland's 26 refineries. The method was always the same. A representative would arrive at your office. He'd lay out 2 options with the calm of a doctor delivering a diagnosis. Option 1, sell your refinery to Standard Oil at fair market value. Keep your reputation. Perhaps stay on as a manager. Your family remains comfortable. Option 2, refuse and discover what happens when Standard Oil decides you're a competitor. Most chose option 1. The few who chose option 2 discovered that their shipping costs suddenly doubled. Their suppliers suddenly couldn't deliver their customers, suddenly found better prices elsewhere. The market wasn't a market anymore. It was a system designed to produce one outcome. By 1879, Standard Oil controlled 90% of American oil refining. 90%. Not through innovation, not through superior products, through systematic elimination of the conditions that make competition possible. But controlling 90% of an industry creates a new problem. It's illegal. Or at least it should have been. The Sherman Antitrust Act wouldn't pass until 1890, but state laws already prohibited monopolies. Standard Oil of Ohio couldn't legally own companies in New York or Pennsylvania. Every state had its own corporate laws, its own restrictions. And this is where Rockefeller's lawyers created something that would reshape corporate America forever. In 1882, attorney Samuel Dodd presented Rockefeller with a solution. They called it the Standard Oil Trust. Here's how it worked. Every Standard Oil company in every state would transfer its stock to a board of 9 trustees. The trustees, all Rockefeller and his closest allies, would manage all the companies as a single unit. Technically, Standard Oil of Ohio didn't own Standard Oil of New York. The trust owned both. It was a legal fiction. Everyone knew the same 9 men controlled everything. But the fiction worked because it existed in a gap the law hadn't anticipated. The trust structure would evolve into the holding company. The holding company would become the foundation of modern corporate organization. Berkshire Hathaway, Alphabet, Meta, Amazon. They're all descendants of what Samuel Dodd invented in 1882 to help Rockefeller evade state monopoly laws. One lawyer's clever workaround became the legal architecture of 21st century capitalism. But here's what happened next. The public started paying attention. Journalists started investigating. Politicians started asking questions. And a 15-year-old girl who watched her father weep at the kitchen table grew up to become the most dangerous threat Rockefeller ever faced. The system that seemed invincible was about to collide with something Rockefeller never planned for, a reckoning that would expose every secret deal, every crushed competitor, every mechanism of control. And what happened next would prove that even destruction could be designed to make the architects richer. The system that seemed invincible was about to collide with something Rockefeller never planned for: a reckoning that would expose every secret deal, every crushed competitor, every mechanism of control. And what happened next would prove that even destruction could be designed to make the architects richer. Ida Tarbell was 44 years old when she began the investigation that would shake Standard Oil to its foundations. She still remembered being 15, watching her father sit at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. The refinery he'd spent 8 years building sold for 40 cents on the dollar. She remembered the silence in the house afterward, the way her father seemed to shrink, the way her mother stopped talking about the future. 28 years of that memory. 28 years of watching Rockefeller become the richest man in the world, while families like hers were erased from history. In 1901, Tarbell convinced McClure's magazine to let her write a series on Standard Oil. What was supposed to be a 3-part series became 19 installments published over 2 years. She interviewed former Standard Oil executives. She obtained internal documents. She traced the secret railroad rebates, the predatory pricing, the systematic destruction of competitors. When The History of the Standard Oil Company was published as a book in 1904, it landed like a bomb. For the first time, the American public could see the mechanism. Not rumors, not accusations, documents, exposed in black and white for anyone who could read. But here's what most people get wrong about the Standard Oil expose. They think Tarbell brought down Rockefeller. They think the government broke up Standard Oil because the public demanded justice. The truth is stranger and more disturbing. By 1904, when Tarbell's book was published, Rockefeller had already stepped back from daily management of Standard Oil. He was 65 years old. He spent his days playing golf, giving away dimes to children, and planning his philanthropic legacy. The public relations disaster of Tarbell's expose barely touched him personally. The man who had crushed thousands of competitors, who had built the most powerful monopoly in American history, who had pioneered every technique of corporate control that still exists today, he was already thinking about what comes after. And that's when Rockefeller made his most brilliant move. In 1909, the Department of Justice filed suit against Standard Oil under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The case went to the Supreme Court. In 1911, the court ruled that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly and ordered it dissolved into 34 separate companies. Picture the newspaper headlines that day. Picture the celebration among reformers who believed they had finally slain the dragon. Theodore Roosevelt, who had made trust-busting the centerpiece of his presidency, declared victory for the American people. Now picture Rockefeller on his golf course in Cleveland, reading those same headlines. He was smiling. Here's the question that reveals everything. If breaking up Standard Oil was supposed to punish Rockefeller, why did his net worth triple in the 2 years after the breakup? Before the dissolution, Standard Oil stock traded at roughly $600 per share. Rockefeller owned about a quarter of the company. After the breakup, he owned the same percentage of 34 separate companies. Within 2 years, the combined value of those 34 companies exceeded $2,000 per share. Rockefeller didn't lose wealth. He gained it. The breakup that was supposed to destroy him made him the richest individual in modern history, $400 billion in today's money. Let that sink in. The government's most powerful weapon against monopoly made the monopolist 3 times richer. Henry Morrison was one of the small refiners who had testified against Standard Oil during the antitrust trial. He'd traveled to Washington at his own expense, spent 3 days describing how the railroad rebates had destroyed his business, how the predatory pricing had left him bankrupt. He believed he was helping to bring justice. Morrison was 57 years old when the Supreme Court ruled against Standard Oil. He read the news in his small apartment in Pittsburgh, where he worked as a bookkeeper, the same profession Rockefeller had started in 40 years earlier. Morrison's refinery was long gone. His savings were long gone. He would die in that apartment in 1918, never knowing that the man who destroyed him had become richer from the breakup than he'd ever been before. This is the rage moment. This is what the system actually looks like. The people who fought Standard Oil, who testified against it, who sacrificed their businesses and their savings to expose the truth. They got justice on paper. Rockefeller got $400 billion. The rules were never designed to punish people like Rockefeller. The rules were designed to look like they punished people like Rockefeller. But wait, if the breakup made Rockefeller richer, why did it work? How does shattering a company into 34 pieces increase its value? 2 reasons, and both reveal how the system perpetuates itself. First, the breakup eliminated the regulatory threat. Once Standard Oil was dissolved, reformers declared victory and moved on. The 34 successor companies were free to operate without the constant scrutiny that had plagued the parent company. The pressure was gone. Second, the breakup created regional monopolies that were actually more efficient than the national monopoly. Standard Oil of New Jersey dominated the East Coast. Standard Oil of California dominated the West Coast. Standard Oil of Indiana dominated the Midwest. They didn't compete with each other. They divided the country into territories just like before, except now it was legal. And here's the twist that history books rarely mention. The 34 companies immediately began merging back together. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. In 1999, they merged to form ExxonMobil. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. It absorbed Standard Oil of Kentucky Gulf Oil and Texaco. Standard Oil of Indiana became Amoco. It was bought by BP in 1998. The monopoly that was destroyed in 1911 spent the next century reassembling itself. Today, most of those 34 companies have reconsolidated into 3 giants: ExxonMobil, Chevron, and BP. The system broke itself up to avoid regulation, then quietly put itself back together over 100 years. Pause for a moment and consider what this means. The most aggressive antitrust action in American history. The case that defined how we think about monopoly, the precedent that's still cited today, didn't actually work. The monopolist got richer, the monopoly reformed, and the method spread to every other industry. This is the architecture Rockefeller built, a system so sophisticated that even its own destruction makes it stronger. But the Standard Oil breakup wasn't Rockefeller's final innovation. The last mechanism, the one that would secure his legacy for generations, was still to come. In 1913, 2 years after the breakup, Rockefeller created the Rockefeller Foundation, with an initial gift of $250 million, over $7 billion in today's money. The stated purpose was philanthropy funding medical research, education, public health. The actual purpose was more complex. Frederick Gates was Rockefeller's chief philanthropic advisor, a former Baptist minister who had convinced Rockefeller that strategic giving could accomplish what business never could. Gates still remembered the meeting in 1910 when he laid out the vision. Picture 2 men in a wood-paneled office, maps and charts spread across a mahogany desk. Gates explained that Rockefeller's reputation was destroyed. The public hated him. Newspapers called him a robber baron, a ruthless tyrant, the most despised man in America. No amount of money could buy that reputation back. But strategic philanthropy could create a new reputation. Fund universities, and you shape what's taught. Fund medical schools, and you shape how medicine is practiced. Fund research, and you shape what questions get asked. The foundation wouldn't just give away money. It would reshape American institutions in ways that served Rockefeller's legacy. Gates was right. The Rockefeller Foundation funded Johns Hopkins Medical School, the University of Chicago Rockefeller University. It established the model for American medical education, the model that emphasized pharmaceutical intervention over holistic care, that created the doctor as authority system that made medicine a lucrative profession tied to corporate interests. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented in the Foundation's own archives. Abraham Flexner was hired by the Rockefeller Foundation to evaluate American medical schools. His 1910 report recommended closing most existing schools and consolidating medical education into a few elite institutions that would receive Rockefeller funding. Within a decade, the number of medical schools in America dropped from 155 to 31. The schools that survived were the ones that adopted the pharmaceutical model. The ones that didn't adapt, that practiced alternative approaches, that questioned the emerging orthodoxy, they disappeared. Rockefeller's foundation didn't just give money to medicine. It redesigned medicine. And here's the final twist that connects everything. Standard Oil's chemical divisions. The parts of the company that produced industrial chemicals and petroleum byproducts eventually evolved into pharmaceutical companies. The same corporate infrastructure that refined oil began synthesizing drugs. The same distribution networks that delivered kerosene began delivering medications. The man who monopolized oil helped create the system that would monopolize medicine. Eleanor Crossley was a midwife in rural Kentucky in 1925. She'd delivered over 2,000 babies in her career using techniques passed down through generations of women healers. That year, the state medical board, following guidelines influenced by Rockefeller-funded reforms, made it illegal to practice midwifery without a license that required formal medical education. Crossley was 63 years old. She couldn't afford medical school. She couldn't pass examinations designed for a system she'd never been trained in. After 40 years of serving her community, she was forced to stop. She lived another 12 years watching younger women travel 50 miles to hospitals for births that she could have handled in their homes. She never understood why the rules had changed. She never knew that the regulations that ended her career could be traced to foundation grants made by the same man who had cornered the oil market. The system doesn't just control industries. It controls the rules that determine who gets to participate. That's Rockefeller's true legacy. Not the money, not the oil, the architecture, the method, the template that every dominant institution has followed for 100 years. And the most disturbing part: the system was designed to make you thank it. Rockefeller died in 1937 at age 97, celebrated as one of America's greatest philanthropists. The foundation he created still operates today, still funds research, still shapes policy. His descendants, the fourth and fifth generations, still control billions in trusts and foundations, still sit on corporate boards, still influence the institutions their ancestor helped design. The man who destroyed Frank Tarbell, who crushed Alexander Morrison, who built a monopoly that extracted wealth from millions of Americans, that man is remembered as a benefactor. The rules don't just extract wealth. They extract gratitude. But the architecture Rockefeller built didn't stop with oil, medicine, and education. It spread. It evolved. It adapted to every new industry, every new technology, every new century. And right now in 2025, you are living inside a system that uses every mechanism Rockefeller invented: vertical integration, horizontal, consolidation, regulatory capture, philanthropic legitimacy, to extract wealth from your life every single day. The question isn't whether Rockefeller won. The question is what his victory costs you. The question isn't whether Rockefeller won. The question is what his victory costs you. And the answer isn't a single number. It's a trajectory, a slow, invisible extraction that compounds over decades, transferring wealth from millions of ordinary lives to a handful of institutions built on Rockefeller's blueprint. The system doesn't collapse. It doesn't explode. It extracts, quietly, legally, every single day. Let me show you what that extraction looks like across a lifetime. Michael Torres was 28 years old in 2014, working as a warehouse supervisor in Phoenix, Arizona. He earned $42,000 a year. He drove a used Honda Civic, lived in a one-bedroom apartment, and saved $300 a month. He believed that if he worked hard and lived modestly, he could build a stable life. 10 years later, Michael is 38. He still works in logistics now, earning $51,000. On paper, that's a 21% raise. But his rent has increased 63%. His health insurance premiums have doubled. Gasoline costs 40% more than it did in 2014. His grocery bill has risen 52%. Michael's real purchasing power, what his money actually buys, has declined by 14% over 10 years of steady work. By 2034, if current trends continue, Michael will be 48 years old with less real wealth than he had at 28. He will have worked 20 years and moved backward. Now consider someone else in the same decade. Sarah Chen was 26 years old in 2014, working as a financial analyst in Boston. She earned $65,000 a year. But Sarah did something different with her savings. Instead of a bank account paying 0.1% interest, she bought index funds. Specifically, she bought shares in the companies that dominate the American economy: ExxonMobil, Amazon Alphabet, JP Morgan Chase. She bought shares in the system. By 2024, Sarah's portfolio had grown 240%. The same companies extracting wealth from Michael's gasoline purchases, Amazon orders and healthcare bills were depositing dividends into Sarah's brokerage account. She didn't work harder than Michael. She didn't create more value. She simply positioned herself on the extracting side of Rockefeller's architecture rather than the extracted side. By 2034, projections suggest Sarah's portfolio will be worth over $1.2 million. Michael's savings, eroded by inflation, will be worth roughly $43,000 in today's purchasing power. Same country, same decade, same economy. Two completely different outcomes based on one variable: understanding the system. This is the Rockefeller legacy playing out in real time invisibly across 330 million American lives. But here's what most people get wrong about this extraction. They think it's about rich versus poor. They think the divide is between billionaires and everyone else. The real divide is between those who own the extractors and those who are extracted from. And that divide includes a vast middle class who could be owners but don't know how the system works. Remember Eleanor Crossley, the Kentucky midwife whose career was ended by Rockefeller-funded medical reforms. Her great-granddaughter, Amanda Crossley, is alive today. She's 34 years old, works as a nurse in Louisville, and spends 18% of her income on healthcare costs, co-pays, deductibles, premiums flowing to pharmaceutical companies, and insurance conglomerates built on structures Rockefeller pioneered. Amanda has never heard of her great-grandmother. She doesn't know that the system extracting wealth from her paycheck was designed by the same man who eliminated her ancestors' livelihood. The extraction feels like nature, like gravity, like just the way things are. That's the genius of the architecture. It becomes invisible within 2 generations. Let me show you the numbers in a way that makes the extraction undeniable. If you could see a chart comparing wealth concentration in 1911, when Standard Oil was broken up, to wealth concentration in 2024, you would see something remarkable. In 1911, the top 1% of Americans owned roughly 40% of national wealth. After the Progressive Era reforms, the New Deal, the Great Society, decades of supposed reform, the top 1% today owns more than 40% of national wealth. We haven't moved backward. We haven't moved forward. We've treaded water for over a century while the extraction mechanisms became more sophisticated. But here's the twist that makes this story more than American. Not every country followed the Rockefeller model. And the ones that didn't look very different today. Germany, after World War II, deliberately constructed a different corporate architecture. They required worker representation on corporate boards, something called codetermination. They limited hostile takeovers. They built systems designed to distribute profits more broadly rather than concentrate them at the top. The result: German median wealth today is roughly $290,000 per adult. American median wealth is roughly $93,000. Germans aren't smarter than Americans. Germans didn't work harder. Germany simply built different rules. Rules that weren't designed by someone who believed competition is a sin. Japan tells a similar story. After World War II, American occupiers actually broke up Japanese monopolies called zaibatsu. But Japan rebuilt its corporate system with interlocking ownership structures, lifetime employment, and profit-sharing arrangements that distributed wealth more broadly. Japanese household debt is roughly 60% of GDP. American household debt is roughly 77%. Japanese workers get paid more relative to corporate profits. American workers get paid less while shareholders get paid more. Same capitalism, different architecture, radically different outcomes. The Rockefeller system isn't inevitable, it's a choice. A choice that was made 150 years ago by one man in Cleveland, and a choice that has been reinforced every decade since by companies following his playbook. But choices can be unmade, which raises the question nobody wants to answer. Why hasn't America changed the rules? David Rockefeller, John D.'s grandson, died in 2017 at age 101. For 50 years, he was chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, founder of the Trilateral Commission, one of the most connected men in global finance. When he died, his estate was valued at over $3 billion. More importantly, David Rockefeller spent his career ensuring that the rules his grandfather had written would never be rewritten. He funded think tanks that promoted deregulation. He cultivated relationships with every president from Eisenhower to Obama. He sat on boards that shaped policy in ways most Americans never saw and wouldn't understand if they did. Thomas Medina was a congressional staffer in 1978 working on banking regulation. He still remembers meeting David Rockefeller at a Washington reception. Picture a 27-year-old policy wonk, nervous in a borrowed suit, shaking hands with American royalty. Rockefeller was charming, gracious, interested in Thomas's work on consumer protection. 2 months later, Thomas's boss changed positions on a key banking provision. The language that would have restricted certain holding company structures was quietly removed from the bill. Thomas never knew if there was a connection. He didn't ask. That's how the system protects itself. Not through obvious corruption, through relationships, through expertise, through generations of accumulated influence that make certain questions seem unreasonable to ask. The Rockefeller family today controls an estimated $11 billion across hundreds of trusts and foundations. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Rockefeller Family Fund, the David Rockefeller Fund. They fund climate research, arts programs, public policy initiatives. They are by any measure among the most philanthropic families in American history. And that's exactly what John D. would have wanted. Remember Frederick Gates, the advisor who designed Rockefeller's philanthropic strategy. His insight was that strategic giving doesn't just buy reputation. It buys control over the questions society asks. Fund climate research, and you shape which solutions seem realistic. Fund arts programs, and you shape what culture gets preserved. Fund public policy, and you shape which reforms seem possible. The extraction continues, but the extractors are celebrated as benefactors. Here's where the trajectory becomes undeniable. In 1980, the average CEO of a large American company earned 42 times what their average worker earned. By 2000, that ratio was 368 to 1. By 2024, it exceeded 400 to 1. If you could visualize this as a timeline, you'd see a hockey stick flat for decades, then suddenly vertical. The inflection point corresponds almost exactly with the deregulation of the 1980s, when the rules that had modestly constrained Rockefeller's architecture were systematically removed. We didn't just fail to fix the system, we removed the few constraints that made it tolerable. Jennifer Walsh was 22 years old in 1985, starting her career at a mid-sized manufacturing company in Ohio. Her starting salary was $18,000. Her CEO earned roughly $750,000. The ratio was about 42 to 1. Jennifer retired in 2023. Her final salary was $68,000. Her company's CEO earned $24 million. The ratio was 353 to 1. Same company, same job function. The workers' real wages grew by roughly 60% over 38 years. The CEO's compensation grew by 3,100%. Jennifer worked the same hours, faced the same stresses, delivered the same value to her employer. But the rules determining how profits were distributed changed in ways that redirected millions from workers like Jennifer to executives and shareholders positioned on the extracting side of the system. By 2034, if current trends continue, the CEO to worker ratio will exceed 500 to 1. Jennifer's successor will earn perhaps $80,000 in today's money. The CEO will earn $40 million. The architecture Rockefeller built is accelerating. Every decade, the extraction becomes more efficient. And the most disturbing part is how normal it feels. Michael Torres doesn't think about Rockefeller when he fills his gas tank. Amanda Crossley doesn't connect her healthcare costs to foundation grants made in 1910. Jennifer Walsh doesn't see the deregulation that redirected her earnings to shareholders. The system has become invisible. It's just the way things are. Just the economy. Just the market. Except it isn't a market. It's an architecture. An architecture designed by one man, refined by his heirs, and replicated by every dominant corporation for 150 years. The extraction doesn't feel like theft because it's legal. It doesn't feel like exploitation because it's normal. It doesn't feel like a system because we've never lived outside it. But other countries have different systems. Different architectures produce different outcomes. The Rockefeller model isn't economics. It's a choice disguised as nature. And that choice is being made again right now in 2025 by companies you interact with every single day. The question isn't what Rockefeller's system cost your grandparents. The question is what it's costing you right now and what it will cost your children. Because the architecture isn't slowing down, it's accelerating. And the next phase has already begun. The architecture isn't slowing down, it's accelerating. And the next phase has already begun. Right now in 2025, you can see Rockefeller's playbook running in real time across every dominant industry. Amazon controls not just online retail, but the logistics infrastructure that competitors must use to deliver their products. The cloud computing services that host their websites, and the marketplace data that reveals which products to copy. Vertical integration so complete that selling against Amazon often means selling through Amazon. Google commands 92% of global search. That's higher market share than Standard Oil at its peak. But Google is considered legal because the product is free. You don't pay with money. You pay with data that's sold to advertisers used to train AI systems and leveraged to maintain dominance in every adjacent market. Rockefeller would have marveled at this innovation. A monopoly so complete that users don't realize they're paying. Meta owns Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, 3 billion users who think they're choosing between platforms but are actually choosing between properties owned by the same company. Horizontal consolidation perfected for the digital age. Pharmaceutical companies fund the FDA through user fees, write the regulations they're supposedly governed by, and extend patents through minor modifications that reset the exclusivity clock. Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, Merck, they learned from Rockefeller. Capture the regulators and you capture the market. The methods haven't changed. The industries have. If you could visualize a map of corporate ownership in America today, you would see something that looks less like a competitive marketplace and more like a circuit board, a handful of massive nodes with thousands of connections flowing through them. Every path leads back to the same concentrated points of control. But here's the contrarian point that makes this video different from every other monopoly documentary you've watched. The system isn't broken. The system is working exactly as designed. Rockefeller didn't build Standard Oil to serve consumers, though it did. He didn't build it to create jobs, though it did. He built it to concentrate wealth and control at the top of a pyramid. And by that measure, the system has succeeded beyond anything he could have imagined. The Rockefeller family's $11 billion is almost a rounding error compared to what the system produces today. Jeff Bezos alone is worth $200 billion. The 5 largest American companies are worth more than the GDP of every country on Earth, except the United States and China. This is Rockefeller's ultimate legacy, not his family's wealth. The architecture that makes such concentration possible, legal and self-perpetuating. Let me close the circle on where we started. Remember Ida Tarbell, the 15-year-old girl who watched her father weep at the kitchen table after selling his refinery for 40 cents on the dollar. She spent her entire adult life fighting the system her father was destroyed by. Her 19-part exposé helped trigger the antitrust case that broke up Standard Oil. She was celebrated as a hero of investigative journalism, a champion of the little guy against corporate tyranny. But here's what happened to her legacy. Ida Tarbell died in 1944. She never married, never had children. She left behind her writing and her reputation, both of which have faded into history textbooks that most Americans never read. Today, the Rockefeller name adorns universities' research centers' public plazas. Rockefeller Center in Manhattan draws millions of visitors every year. The Rockefeller Foundation is cited as a model of enlightened philanthropy. John D. Rockefeller is remembered as a complicated figure, yes, but ultimately as a builder, a visionary, a man who shaped modern America. Frank Tarbell is remembered by no one. His daughter's great work, the investigation that exposed the most powerful monopoly in American history, is a footnote. The man she exposed is a monument. The system doesn't just extract wealth, it extracts memory. It decides who gets remembered and who gets erased. So where does that leave you? This video wasn't financial advice. It wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was pattern recognition, an attempt to show you the architecture that was built 150 years ago and still shapes your life today. The pattern is simple. Vertical integration to control costs. Horizontal consolidation to eliminate competitors. Regulatory capture to write the rules. Philanthropy to buy legitimacy. And structures designed to survive even their own destruction. You see this pattern in oil, in tech, in pharmaceuticals, in banking, in every sector where a handful of companies dominate and competition has become performance rather than reality. Understanding the pattern doesn't make you rich. It doesn't make you powerful, but it does something the system would prefer you never achieve. It makes you aware. And awareness changes the questions you ask. Instead of asking which gas station has the cheapest price, you might ask, why all the gas stations have nearly identical prices? Instead of asking which social media platform to use, you might ask why every platform seems to evolve toward the same advertising-driven, attention-extracting model. Instead of asking which health insurance plan to choose, you might ask why all the plans seem designed to maximize what you pay while minimizing what you receive. The system depends on you asking the first set of questions. The questions about choices within the system. It prefers you never ask the second set. The questions about the system itself. Here's a simple framework. Not investment advice, just questions. When you spend money, ask, is this company using Rockefeller's playbook? Do they control their supply chain? Have they eliminated meaningful competition? Do they influence their regulators? Do their founders run philanthropic foundations that shape public perception? When you save money, ask, am I being extracted from, or am I participating in the extraction? When you vote, ask, does this candidate understand the architecture, or are they promising to fix symptoms while the structure remains untouched? The answers won't make you a billionaire. They might help you see more clearly. And seeing clearly is the beginning of everything. Michael Torres is still in Phoenix, still working. Logistics, still watching his purchasing power erode year by year. He doesn't know about Rockefeller. He doesn't think about corporate architecture. He just feels in a way he can't quite articulate that the game is rigged, that working hard and playing by the rules doesn't produce the results he was promised. He's right. The game is rigged. Not by a shadowy conspiracy, but by structures designed 150 years ago and refined every decade since. Sarah Chen is still in Boston, still watching her portfolio grow, still positioned on the extracting side of the equation. She doesn't think about Rockefeller either. She just follows the standard advice: invest in index funds, buy and hold, let compound growth work over time. She's also right. The advice works because it aligns you with the system rather than against it. Both of them are living inside the same architecture. One is being extracted from. One is participating in the extraction. Neither fully sees the structure they inhabit. That's the Rockefeller system. Not a company. A method. Not a conspiracy. An architecture. Not a secret. A pattern hiding in plain sight. You cannot escape it. You cannot opt out. You cannot find some pure space outside the reach of vertical integration, horizontal consolidation, and regulatory capture. But you can see it, and seeing it changes everything. John D. Rockefeller died in 1937, believing he had served God by bringing order to chaos efficiency, to waste consolidation to competition. He believed his monopoly was moral because it worked. The system he built still works. It extracts more efficiently than ever. It concentrates more completely than ever. It perpetuates itself more effectively than ever. The only question that remains is the question Rockefeller never had to answer. What do you do once you can see the walls? Competition is a sin. Rockefeller said it believed it and built an entire world to prove it. 150 years later, you're living in that world, buying from monopolies, paying through oligopolies, saving in institutions designed to extract rather than serve. You can't escape the architecture, but you can finally see it. And in a system designed to be invisible, seeing is the first act of freedom.